So in South Africa, a road-based public transport service can only be operated by a person if he or she is the holder of a public operating license, right? This applies to taxi drivers, bus drivers, or any other driver who transports people on the road in return for payment. Now, an interesting topic recently is the question of whether these operating licenses can be sold or hired. Although there are strict guidelines in law here in South Africa, not everyone is aware of the procedures that they need to follow and what is required of them. Joining us via Skype this morning to unpack all of this is the head of legal research at LegalWise, George Pelser. A very good morning to you, brother. What is an operating license? I mean, let's just start with explaining that bit.
So, as you already said, an operating license is a license that authorizes a person to actually use a vehicle for public transport, for example, a bus or a taxi. So what is important to note of this is that it allows you to actually conduct that business of a public transport service. Without that, you won't be able to receive any money from people who uses this service. So what is also important to note is that this operating license is only for a specific vehicle. So if you own more than one vehicle, as part of your services that you render, you will have to get an operating license for each of those vehicles. So that's an important thing to take note of as well. So that's just basically what an operating license is in a nutshell.
And that said, George, can an operating license then be transferred? I mean, if so, what's needed to apply for a transfer, and where does one go to apply for such transfers?
From one province to another province. So it's from different provinces. You have to apply to the National Public Transport Regulator for the operating license to be transferred. If it's between provinces or municipal districts, you can go to the municipalities' offices to get the operating license.
Okay.
The application for the transfer or the operating license. So, but what is needed is that one must also take into account that, you know, there are different people who can apply for this. So, as I said, it is possible to transfer the operating license. So if I'm the regional holder and you want the transport license, the operating license from me, I can go and apply for it to be transferred to your name, or you can go and apply for it to be transferred to your name. But if you apply for it, what should be remembered is that you will need my consent as the regional holder of this operating license for it to be transferred to your name. So that must accompany the application form. Apart from that, your owners are consenting. What is also necessary is quite a lot of documents, and we do have a bit of an extended list on our website for everybody to go and look at. So I'm just going to quickly briefly mention a few. So you will have to include proof of payment. So there's an administration fee of about 300 Rand per vehicle per application for the transfer that must be paid. And that proof of payment must accompany your application for the transfer. You will also have to include proof of insurance. So do you have, for example, public liability insurance, because you're now dealing with the risk of transferring people from the public. And then you also have to include certified copies, for example, of your identity document, the vehicle registration certificate, the vehicle license disc, the roadworthiness certificate, as well as the vehicle service records or maintenance records, so that they can see that the vehicle is in a good condition, and together with either proof of the services that have been rendered so far, or a business plan, depending on the situation. So these are just a few of the requirements that must be met in order for you to apply for this transfer of the operating license.
And that's in the transfer context, George, obviously. So can an operating license be hired, though?
So with that, what is meant is the fact that, you will pay me, I'm the owner of an operating license, you will pay me a monthly amount to use my operating license. So that is a bit tricky as well, and I'll get to what the legislation actually says. But just to give some background, remember the operating license is in my name. I'm the one authorized to use this license. So you can't just rent it out, for example. And that's also very clear in the National Land Transport Act that regulates the operating licenses. It specifically says it cannot be hired out. So it is not possible in that circumstances. However, it must not be confused with, for example, an employment relationship where I, as the owner of an operating license and a public transport services, employ drivers to use these operating licenses on my behalf, basically. So it's an employment agreement. That's completely different from just hiring it out, which is not allowed in terms of the legislation.
And I guess in the same vein, I can ask the same question, can it then be sold?
So in that is a different situation, because now you are transferring it actually. So sold is completely, I'm selling you my license. So it's changing ownership at the end of the day. So as I said, it is possible to transfer it. However, the legislation is not very clear on the aspect of whether compensation can be paid for this transfer. I had to look at some case law to try and get the answer about this as well. And there has been a case a few years back where a vehicle was sold together with the operating license. So what happened is that the agreement specifically said this vehicle together with the operating license must be sold for this amount of money. So it does seem that it is possible, depending on the circumstances as well. So, and then what the court eventually said is, because what happened is that the owner refused to actually give consent for the transfer of the operating license. So the matter went to court, and the court then eventually said, well, the agreement said you must transfer the operating license, so you have to give your consent. So again, as I said, it's not clear whether compensation can be received for the operating license on its own. However, there has been some cases that give some clarity that it is possibly, maybe possible to actually transfer it or it being sold together with a vehicle.
And George, as we wrap up our conversation this morning, in the event that a dispute arises with the transfer of the operating license, how can one resolve that?
So first of all, I think all disputes must always be tried to be resolved with the two parties. So if there's a dispute and the operating license or the owner doesn't want to consent to the operating license being transferred, although there's been an agreement, I think the first step would be to try and resolve this dispute amicably between the two parties. If that's not possible, then the National Public Transport Regulator is the regulator actually controlling all of these procedures and applications, and they can also be approached to try and resolve this dispute as amicably as possible, so that you can try and avoid that actually going to court.
Awesome stuff, George. Always fascinating just hearing you unpack all the legalities around certain things in South Africa. Thank you so much for your time this morning.
You're welcome, William. That's
George Pelser. He is the head of legal research at LegalWise. Of course, if you'd like to join LegalWise, SMS the word join to 41295.